First of all, I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about where I came from, and I hope that'll give you some confidence in what I'm going to say a little bit later. I was born to parents who went through the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Both my parents were patriots. Dad served in World War II. I grew up on small beef and dairy farms. About 100 head of beef cows was the biggest we ever had, and we typically milked about 80 dairy cows. I went to veterinary school, and I went into practice about 45 miles from where I grew up. I was in practice for about 30 years in a mixed practice, mostly beef, cow, calf, had some dairies, and then we did some small animal work also. So I was in southeastern Oklahoma. The majority, when I first got out of vet school, the average herd size in Oklahoma was 17. That was beef cattle herd. I don't know what it is now exactly, but probably 35 or so, maybe 40. So small producers, and those were the people that I made my living off of for 30 years. And a lot of them are still the people that I deal with now in my job as state veterinarian in Oklahoma. I interact with Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association, who represents typically the larger cattle producers in the state. The little small guys don't join those organizations a lot. I work with the Livestock Marketing Association. I feel like we've got a good relationship with them. So that's kind of where I come from. And let me see, I don't know if this is going to apply to my PowerPoint at all. So our traceability system, I got to thinking, 25 years ago when we had brucellosis, we had a really, really good traceability system because of that disease. But we had about 70 field people between the state and veterinary services at that time. We collected data from all of our livestock markets because we were doing first point testing. For several of those years back at that time, heifers were required to be calf foot vaccinated if they went back to the country. So in many cases, we had ID to the premises of birth. And every time they moved through a livestock market or if they changed hands in the state for private treaty, they had to be bled for brucellosis. If they went to other states, and we trade a lot with Texas, so they had to be brucellosis tested for many of those years to go to Texas. So we had a really robust traceability system. It was in, I think, was it called the GDB, General Database? Generic database. So when I first started to work at the state of Oklahoma in 2006, we could still access that database, but we were no longer putting any data into it because as we became brucellosis free, the funding dried up. During the time when we had that really good traceability system, we had 7 women in the office that all they did was type official ID into that database from all the documents that came in from all the testing and vaccination that was done. Unfortunately, we can't access that anymore. We lost all of that ID because we lost funding. And maybe, I don't know if we could have kept it, if we could have foreseen the need for that traceability. But so now we're spending millions of dollars trying to build that traceability database back. Our traceability system is very similar to the 2 states that you've already heard. We were fortunate, I think, in that we didn't eradicate brucellosis. We became brucellosis free in 2000. We continued first point testing until 2009 because we wanted to continue first point testing for a year after Texas went brucellosis free. So by 2009, we could see that there was beginning to be more talk about traceability, or at that time, I think we were still calling it NIAA. So we were able to work with our LMA group in the state to continue collecting the identification. So everything is done just as it was when we were first point testing, except the veterinarian is not taking the blood samples. So we're still getting identification information on our adult cattle, all dairy cattle, and roping type event cattle that go through our livestock markets. As we're now, the one blank spot that we had in our previous traceability system was the CVIs. They were just stored in boxes in a big building, and it was really difficult if we ever had to go back to those. And we did not capture the the identification on those CVIs. Now we are, with the advent of electronic CVIs, we are getting a lot of that into our database. So we've got about 55 auction markets in our state that sell cattle. And we do require them to have a veterinarian on staff. And as I said, we collect all that livestock market data. We tried to pass a rule this last year. We proposed a rule that would require cattle changing ownership, ID eligible cattle changing ownership in the country by private treaty to be identified. That rule got sidetracked before we ever actually proposed it to the legislature. We're working with some of the other agriculture organizations now, and we believe that we're going to be able to propose it again, and we believe we're going to get it passed. So that's going to help some. Of course, we don't have the field staff to monitor all those sales, and obviously not everyone is going to follow the rules, but we think a lot of people will, and we believe that will help us with our traceability. So we had the same thing that Colorado had with the South Dakota TB traces. We ended up with 5 traces from South Dakota. 4 of them were pretty easy to do. They were from South Dakota. They may have gone through one other producer in another state and then come to Oklahoma. We had one that was very convoluted and was pretty scary for us. So we initially, 2 years after the cattle moved into our state, was when South Dakota discovered the infected herd. So we were already 2 years behind. We got the one, and then over the next about month or so, we were notified of the other 4. And this is just, you can't really see that, but this is an illustration of all those traces that we had. The one on the upper left is one that went through Wyoming and ended up in Oklahoma. The one on the upper right is one that went through Minnesota, I believe it was, into Oklahoma. And then the one kind of in the middle there, those all started out with cattle from Belle Fourche Livestock in South Dakota. 2 of those went through Colorado and then came to Oklahoma producers. The one that's mostly in the middle there with all the little different shapes and colors, that was one producer that brought 66 head of cattle from South Dakota. We had a certificate of veterinary inspection. It was well written. It was plain. We had the official ID on all 66 of those cattle. They were open 2-year-old heifers was the predominant description of those cattle. Unfortunately, that producer is, if you want to use the term loosely, he's a livestock dealer. In my opinion, he's unethical, and he caused us a lot of trouble, and could have caused us to spread TB across the state. We're very confident that if cattle go through a livestock auction market in Oklahoma, we have the ID in our database, which is USA Herds, and we can type in those numbers and find out where those cattle went, what livestock auction they went through. Out of those 66 head, and this man told us that he sells all of his cattle through markets, out of 66 head, we only found 14 of them. We searched, as you can see, we went to what few records he had, which were mainly just copies of checks that he had received for cattle. We tested 14 herds of cattle. We put those producers through a lot of trouble, and we knew at the time it was probably unnecessary, but we had to do everything we could to prove that were doing everything we could. Three cows from that infected herd in South Dakota were in that 66 head, and we never found those. So the other 4, we did not find any TB in those herds. We tested about 450 head. There were 4 cows from that infected premises in one of those groups. We slaughtered those and did a thorough TB examination and didn't find anything there. So, as I said, we tested about 450 cows in 14 herds that probably really didn't need to be tested. We believe what happened was this guy pulled the tags out of the cows and sold them as feeder heifers because they were young, approximately 2 years old, open. So we think he we think he just illegally and unethically did that. So would electronic tags have helped that? Probably not. This guy probably would have cut them out anyway. But the fact that those tags say unlawful to remove, that may keep some people from cutting them out in the process of what a lot of cattle dealers call cleaning the cows up before they resell them. And you know, I come back to, well, if we required all classes of cattle, or as Mr. Leathers said, if we required all female cattle over 12 months of age that are sexually intact to be tagged, would that have helped? Well, I think it would in this case, because then those feeder heifers that he was mixing those with would have been required to be tagged, and it wouldn't have been as advantageous for him to have removed those tags. So I agree that we need to wait before we start tagging everything, but I do think we need to move forward with the traceability discussions. I think we need to set a target, and once we prove that we can do it in the adult cattle, I think we need to move to tagging everything. Now, the other part I'm going to say is, as I said, I've practiced in a part of Oklahoma, and the majority of my producers were little small producers, average 30, 35, 40 head. They were not in the cattle business to truly make money. If they ever took the time to sit down with a pencil and paper, they were probably losing money on their cattle. But they had jobs in town. Their cattle herd was 3rd, 4th, 5th on their list of priorities. They had them because they had some land. Their parents had maybe owned the land. They needed to do something with that land, and it was just easy to have some cattle. Many of them never got those calves up except when they got them in a pen to run them into a trailer to take them to the sale barn. Those people did not join Oklahoma Cattlemen's Association. They were probably members of Farm Bureau or one other agriculture-based insurance company in the state. But they were probably members of Farm Bureau because it was good insurance. And they probably didn't go to the Farm Bureau meetings to learn about traceability or anything. A few of them we could get to go to our little county cattlemen's association meetings, and we would talk about issues like this. And you know, there's always those 1 or 2 that they want to do whatever's new. That was so they were on board. But the majority of them, if it took any extra effort, they weren't going to do it. And I think in this discussion this morning, it just seems to me like we're forgetting about those. Because if we're going to wait for all segments of the cattle industry to get on board with voluntary ID program or traceability or ADT or whatever we call it, I think we're going to be waiting a long, long time. I believe the industry is represented here today. What I call the industry is the people who kind of see the big picture. And certainly those smaller producers are part of the industry, but they really don't care. As long as they can load up a few calves and go to the local sale barn and sell those calves, they don't care if we can sell internationally. They could care less whether we sell beef to China or not. They just want to be able to sell a few calves to use the money for whatever they want to use it for. So they don't care about value-added programs. It's just not important to them. And you all certainly can disagree with me, but I said what I said at the beginnings to hopefully convince you that I do know these people. I mean, my mom and dad are those people, or were those people. So I just think we, as the people who see the big picture, I really think we need to think more about making this mandatory. I think that's the only way we ever get the entire cattle industry on the page, is if we make it mandatory. So I appreciate you all.